AI is changing everything. Every Google search, every image generator, every ChatGPT prompt runs inside buildings filled with thousands of computers operating 24 hours a day. These buildings consume enormous amounts of electricity, so enormous in fact that some of the world's largest tech companies are now turning to an unexpected solution.
Nuclear reactors, but not the ones built half a century ago, like the one right behind me, but rather a new generation of advanced reactors that promise safety, continuous, reliable, and low carbon energy. But here's the question. Should governments then help build these nuclear reactors whose primary purposes are then to power these private AI companies? This isn't just an engineering question, however. It is also a question of energy policy, fairness, public investment, and who ultimately benefits from these investments.
Artificial intelligence is creating one of the fastest growing sources of electricity demand that we've seen in decades. Unlike a laptop that occasionally can go to sleep, large language models, cloud computing, and data storage operate continuously. Interruptions then cost companies a lot of money, to the point where milliseconds matter. That means these facilities need electricity that is available almost all of the time. This is where nuclear then enters the conversation. The US Department of Energy has identified advanced reactors as a possible source of reliable carbon-free electricity that is capable of supporting future grid demand. At the same time, we're seeing several of these large tech companies having announced partnerships or contracts with nuclear energy because they're seeking dependable low-carbon power. But before asking whether nuclear should power AI, we first need to understand why engineers are so attracted to advanced reactors in the first place. One of nuclear's biggest strengths is something called the capacity factor. Capacity factor measures how often a power plant is actually producing electricity compared to its maximum possible output. Because reactors operate for long periods of times between their refueling outages, nuclear power plants typically maintain a much higher capacity factor than weather-dependent renewable sources, such as solar or wind. And for an AI data center, that reliability matters a lot. Thousands of servers cannot simply stop every time the wind starts to slow down, and so the engineering characteristic, continuous electricity, directly influences the economic value of these facilities. The technical design becomes part of a societal discussion about digital infrastructure. Advanced reactors also incorporate something called passive safety. Traditional reactors rely heavily on powered pumps, emergency diesel generators, and active operator systems. Many Gen 4 designs instead use gravity, natural circulation, or convection to remove decay heat during certain accident scenarios. But why does this matter? Because engineering improvements affect more than engineering. Public confidence in nuclear energy has always depended on perceptions of safety. When reactor designs reduce dependence on active safety systems, they also influence how society evaluates nuclear risk. Technical innovation changes public acceptance. Another advantage is modular construction. Instead of constructing every nuclear reactor almost entirely on site, many advanced reactors are designed so that large parts and sections can be manufactured in factories. Standardization could eventually reduce construction costs and improve project schedules, but only after enough reactors have been built to move beyond the expensive, first-of-a-kind risks and projects. Again, the engineering solution depends on the manufacturing capability, workforce development, and sustained investment. Technology alone just isn't enough. That's why we also have to look into the socio-technical aspects of this problem as well.
Artificial intelligence data infrastructure requires continuous baseload electricity. While advanced and existing nuclear reactors are equipped to meet demand because of their high capacity factors, dedicating large amounts of nuclear power exclusively to private technology companies creates market distortions and grid reliability challenges for regional transmission organizations, otherwise known as RTOs. In limited capacity markets, such as the PJM interconnection, removing nuclear power from auctions can make the grid more unreliable. During the December 2025 PJM capacity auction for the 2026-27 delivery year, the region experienced a capacity deficit of 6,623 megawatts. Growing data center demand outpaced the construction of new generation resources, causing capacity clearing prices to reach the government cap of $333.44 per megawatt day, creating roughly $16.4 billion in total capacity costs for the region. This deficit shows an allocation issue. If we dedicate nuclear capacity to private customers, we reduce the capacity available to the larger grid during periods of high demand. Under these conditions, utilities might need to employ higher-cost, carbon-intensive peaking plants, like natural gas combustion turbines, to maintain N1 reliability, otherwise known as the ability to continue operating after the loss of a major grid component. In total, this increases electricity costs and carbon emissions, while zero-carbon nuclear power is only for private data centers. To avoid multi-year RTO interconnection queues and transmission upgrade delays, multiple technology companies proposed behind-the-meter (BTM) co-location, where data centers connect directly to a nuclear power plant switchyard instead of through the regional grid. An example of BTM co-location involved Amazon Web Services and Talen Energy, which proposed co-locating an AWS data center at the 2.5 gigawatt Susquehanna Steam Electrical Station. Regional transmission utilities, including Elexon and AEP, filed objections with the Federal Regulatory Commission over the modified interconnection service agreement. They argued that under the proposed behind-the-meter configuration, the data center would receive power from the plant while continuing to use the regional grid for backup power and other grid services without paying transmission or network charges. The FERC estimated this arrangement could shift approximately $140 million per year in transmission costs to residential and commercial ratepayers. In November of 2024, the FERC rejected the proposed ISA in a 2-to-1 decision, concluding that the behind-the-meter arrangement raised concerns about cost shifting and grid reliability. Following the ruling, Amazon and Talen created a front-of-the-meter contract, signing a 17-year, $18 billion power purchase agreement for 1,920 megawatts through the regional grid. While the FTM structure forces the customer to pay for the transition charges, contracting almost 2 gigawatts of nuclear capacity still raises concern about data centers getting all the clean energy while the rest of the broader grid is left with carbon-intensive energy sources. Restarting retired nuclear reactors and constructing first-of-a-kind advanced reactors requires large amounts of upfront capital investment and involves financial and regulatory risk. Factors like these make nuclear projects difficult to finance through private investment alone. The federal government encourages the deployment and operation of carbon-free nuclear generation by providing financial incentives to reduce risk and allow easier access to capital. The U.S. Department of Energy, the DOE, Loans Programs Office, LPO, provides loan guarantees through the Title 17 Clean Energy Financing Program and other initiatives. Loan guarantees reduce borrowing costs by lowering financial risk for private lenders, making new nuclear projects more financially viable. Additionally, the Inflation Reduction Act established the Section 45U Nuclear Production Tax Credit, which provides production-based tax incentives for zero-emission nuclear power plants. The main issue here is how public investments are being distributed. Federal loan guarantees and tax incentives reduce the financial risk of developing nuclear infrastructure, but they do it using public money. However, all the electricity is assigned to those corporations through power purchase agreements. As a result, public funding does not mean the public gets the energy. The Crane Clean Energy Center, previously the 3 Mile Island Unit 1, will be our case study. Owned and operated by Constellation Energy, the plant restarts about 835 megawatts of carbon-free baseload nuclear generation with support from the federal DOE LPO financing. In addition to clean energy tax credits, Constellation has entered a 20-year PPA with Microsoft, under which Microsoft will purchase all of the plant's energy and benefit from all the clean energy incentives. Although the electricity generated by the facility is delivered into the PJM transmission system and contributes to the regional grid, the rights to the plant's generation are entirely Microsoft's. However, we have to consider all the arguments presented by these big tech companies. Supporters argue long-term PPAs provide guaranteed revenue required to finance these nuclear projects. This financial certainty improves access to private investment and allows reactor restarts or first-of-a-kind reactor deployments that would otherwise be considered financially impractical. Corporations state PPAs support investments in plant upgrades, switchyard improvements, transmission interconnections, and long-term operation and maintenance, which improve regional infrastructure while extending the operating lifetime of existing facilities. Long-term corporate offtake agreements do more than provide electricity to corporations. They provide an incentive to restart or develop nuclear generation that would never have been constructed otherwise. On one side, corporate PPAs are a catalytic capital that enables reactor restarts and infrastructure upgrades that extend operating life. On the other side, massive amounts of nuclear energy is held from the public, and it's all financed using public tax dollars.
The first issue I want to cover is how the environmental risks and economic benefits of nuclear-powered data centers are distributed. Particularly, who assumes the environmental risks and who receives the benefits. The risks and benefits are not equally distributed. Host areas deal with noise and dust pollution, as well as higher water consumption, while at the same time, data center companies receive electricity and revenue. The local governments will benefit in property taxes, and artificial intelligence services will be beneficial to the individuals who use them. However, this creates an interesting dynamic. The people who experience the environmental consequences are not the same as the people who receive the large economic and technological value. Because of this, whether an SMR should be used to supply an AI data center should consider all the participating parties. Another important issue is the location. Some areas are limited to access to usable water, so implementing a larger scale energy production as well as a data center would cut into the supply and have negative consequences for the residents. Additionally, new construction requires land, which cuts into usable habitats for animals in the area. Important considerations will have to be made to ensure proper relocation of those species. Also, who decides whether these impacts are okay? Different institutions control different parts of the approval process. The NRC takes care of the nuclear safety and some environmental effects, while the state oversees most of the rest, including water withdrawals, emissions, and environmental permitting. The local governments control zoning and some infrastructure, while the utility companies determine how the resources produced by that project will be distributed to the people in that area. Residents, however, are sometimes allowed to submit public comment, but they have very limited control over the final decision. This is important because technical review can determine whether a project meets the legal and regulatory requirements. However, meeting those requirements does not automatically mean that the project is socially okay for the community. The decision to implement this technology should consider whether residents have input on the project or whether they're only considered after these major changes have been made. The project should also prioritize transparency. Before a project receives approval, communities should have access to enough information to completely understand its footprint. For example, a water report should distinguish between water that is withdrawn and water that is permanently consumed. This will provide the clarity needed to provide assurance in these new technology systems. Without standardized requirements, companies and communities may rely on information that's incomplete or difficult to understand. However, there will need to be some protections on what is released to the public because it's important to balance the transparency with the security, especially over a nuclear system. The second major issue is opportunity cost. Billions of dollars, workers, materials, and many other resources are going to be determined over this project. And policymakers are going to be tasked with determining where that money should go and where those resources should be allocated. Each investment determined by these policymakers covers a different part of the problem. For power production, an advanced reactor may provide low carbon electricity over a very long time period. However, there's a lot of technical and social issues that need to be addressed first. Alternatively, if the company optimizes its energy use, especially through its computing power, it may reduce the amount of generation that's needed and may not require an SMR to be put in that place. It's possible that an existing nuclear power plant could be uprated or relicensed much faster and much cheaper than an advanced reactor may be to have to designed, licensed, and ultimately built. Because of this, it shouldn't be looked at through a new technology versus old technology lens, but rather what makes the most sense economically. Another important question to consider is which investment continues providing value if the AI demand is no longer needed or it overestimated its use. Some infrastructure may have benefit to the surrounding area, like a new transmission line or upgraded systems. However, an SMR that's dedicated to one data center may have issues connecting to a public grid, let alone selling to a public grid to benefit the people in that area. However, a SMR construction would provide new knowledge and operational experience to potentially allow for some security for more of them to be built in opportunistic locations in the future. Timing is another possible issue. Advanced nuclear reactors may be valuable in the long term, but investors may want the site to operate before an SMR is providing electricity. Waiting for an advanced reactor would leave utilities without enough capacity in the short term. Building a natural gas plant as a temporary solution could help with these shortages, but it could also create long-term dependence on fossil fuel. You could construct renewables like wind and solar to offset that, but those resources are reliant on conditions that aren't always available. Therefore, a multi-step plan may be more reasonable than choosing a streamlined timeline. Near-term investments in infrastructure, existing nuclear plants, and other available resources could cover that immediate reliability, while advanced reactors and other clean energy technologies could be developed later. However, this would require new evaluations for licensing, construction, and commercial operation. Finally, funding could be evaluated based on milestones rather than a full upfront cost. Initial funding could support the engineering and design development, while additional funding could depend on the project reaching specific licensing milestones. Before construction support is provided, the project could be required to produce an updated cost and schedule estimate based on these newer licensing requirements. The data center could also be required to sign a binding financial commitment. This plan would allow the government to stop, reduce, or modify its support to the project if it becomes technically unworkable, way too expensive, or no longer necessary. However, if funding appears too fluid, it may be difficult to find investors to get this technology up and running. Therefore, it's going to be a difficult balance to determine what is a viable investment and what should be determined at a later date. Overall, the opportunity cost should consider more than which technology produces electricity. It should examine which investments can be deployed, when they are needed, which will remain valuable, and what will provide the greatest combination of public benefit as well as public safety.
Advanced reactors may become an important source of reliable carbon-free electricity for this AI revolution. The engineering is promising. Passive safety, high capacity factors, modular construction, and improved reliability. But none of those technical achievements answer the most important question. Who should benefit from publicly supported infrastructure? As AI transforms the world's demand for electricity, society must decide not only whether advanced reactors can power the future, but whether they should, under what conditions, and for whose benefits. The future of nuclear energy isn't determined by engineering alone. It's also determined by the choices society makes.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe for more cute aesthetic background music. New playlists coming soon.